I suppose we're looking at the Irish example, so the Irish Civil War, and it's heartbreaking, Dermot, because as you say, there it's people who were so close. Now, if we look at, look, it can be replicated. This can be, applied to other countries that have gone through civil wars and had that revolutionary experience, and then the civil war follows. Now, Ireland's experience is that our civil war followed very quickly on from our war of independence. So you've got the 1916 rising, then 1919 to 21 is that real intense period of the war of independence, and then what, less than a year later, when the war of independence ended, you have the treaty negotiations that leads to this, Anglo-Irish treaty that cements partition. And then, like, within that 11-month period, people who were closer than families are killing each other. And what I've discovered is that there was no rhyme or reason to way people made their decisions. There's very different reasons for people making the choice to go one side or the other. There's no one formula. Like, it's not just because, oh, I think that this Anglo-Irish treaty is the stepping stone to give us the chance to get full freedom later. It depended on a lot of things. So you have that, as in people who look at the treaty and see that, okay, it's independence, limited independence for 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland. Partition had existed a year before. So in 1920 with the Government of Ireland Act, so partition was there. It's a reality. It's not part of this treaty. It's cemented by the treaty. It's our side recognising partition exists. Um, the big thing is, when people are looking at the treaty, is the oath of allegiance or the oath of faithfulness that had to be taken to the king, because the Republicans, if you signed up to the IRA, the IRB, the secret revolutionary movement that planned everything, coming on, the women's revolutionary movement, they swore an oath of allegiance to the Republic. Now, these people had killed, had suffered for that oath. And if you look at the treaty debates, and they're all online, they're on oireachtas.ie, that website. Just type in Treaty and all the debates will come up. And the main argument is the oath of allegiance. It's not about partition. It's not about the North, because both sides saw that, okay, the North exists. We don't like it, but we'll work on that. There's a boundary commission that will hopefully sort out the issue of the border, and we'll become so small, and the North will eventually come in. So the oath, this is the key thing, that people had fought, killed, been tortured, suffered horrendously, did horrible things for the Republic. So that's the main argument, right? But so you have that argument from both sides going, look, okay, I'm going to accept this because it's not perfect, but this is all we're going to get now. The other side, the anti-treaty side, would say, look, we're stronger together. Britain is this close. If she's going to give us this, if we push her a little bit more, she'll give us. But it was never about Ireland, right? This is all about empire, because you must, from the British perspective, it's like a domino effect. If one country got freedom from the empire, the whole empire would collapse. And we think of the world being sort of a bit, as not as advanced, technologically, and with media. Oh my God, all eyes were on Ireland at this time, because every colony was looking to Ireland, and the newspapers like really got the information across the world very quickly. So you've got revolutionaries in Egypt watching what's going on. You've got people in India watching what's going on. Every place, Palestine, right? All of these, and like there's a network. Like there's Irish revolutionaries being sent over to Egypt to talk to the activists there. So we think today we're very advanced with our social media and so on. 100 years ago, different methods, but very, very quick. And everyone's watching. So Britain's very much aware that we give one of our colonies independence, the whole empire is going to collapse. And at the heart of this, it's all about empire. So that's their arguments, as in, partition and so on. Look at what happens in Ireland. Ireland is a testing ground for everything that happens across the empire in the next 50, 60, 70 years, where her colonies break away. That has Britain left any country where it's not partitioned? No. So you divide, you conquer, you leave that conflict and so on, which leads then to these civil wars and years and years and years of conflict. Go back far enough in history and you'll find the root cause of this. And it's the British government, to protect their empire, they divide, they conquer. But so that's one argument. That's one way people chose. But then you have people who, it was the loyalty to their commanding officer in the IRA. Now, if their commanding officer went pro-treaty, well, a lot of the guys went, right, I'll follow him. There's an exception with the women. So you had Cumann na mBan, which was the Women's Revolutionary Movement, and the IRA. So the IRA obviously is the men, and both organisations, soon after the treaty was passed by the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, they both decided, right, we as an organisation need to hold a convention, let our delegates, let the representatives of the bodies vote on whether we as a group will accept or reject the treaty, because they're the militants, they're the combatants. You've got the politicians in the Dáil, they have voted, they have passed that treaty, but now it's time for the militants. The women were the first to hold a convention in February 1922. The Dáil vote on it in January. Cumann na mBan waste no time. They call a convention. It's held in Dublin. Now, not all of the delegates could go. Not all of the branches around the country represented, because it was a rail strike, and some of the northern branches didn't come down, and some of them boycotted it. But regardless of that, the women overwhelmingly rejected the treaty. Right, so it's a real, I think it's 641 votes to 43. So even if the other delegates came, I really don't think it would have made a difference. The women were like, this is not what we signed up for. Now, because of that, the women are then seen to be emotional and irrational, and they're storing it. Like, the women are sort of, saying, bring on civil war, bring on war, which you've got a lot of the men making speeches that are saying, hey, let's wade through Irish blood and all of this. And when they're saying it to guys who have killed for this republic. And it's weird that the military men are the ones that are actually trying to find ways to heal, to stop that the inevitable from happening. And you've got the politicians that are stored in it, as you always do. And then when it's gas, because the military are realizing, if we cross that line, there's no going back. And when they then start to kill each other, you've got the politicians going, oh, no, hang on. And they're trying to stop. And it's like, no, we've crossed that line now. And there's only going to be one victor. And both sides were determined to be the victorious side. In the end, it was the government, the pro-treaty side. So the IRA then hold their convention in March. And the government, the provisional government, the pro-treaty side, they start to get worried, because there were so many men that were anti-treaty, who also were very well armed, were very experienced gunmen, and to put their sort of control on it, the government, the pro-treaty side, ban the convention. Right? They say, anyone goes to this convention, you aren't going to get any money. You're going to be kicked out of the army, because one part of the treaty was that we would get our own army. So you've got guys that are, everyone joins up. Basically, if you'd pre-war service, as in you were IRA before the truce, you joined up. So you've got guys that are not sure about what side they're going to be on, but they joined the army. But once the government banned the convention, a lot of them, that then makes a lot of them decide, I'm not supporting this, and they go on the anti-treaty side. Then you have examples of people when the Civil War began. You have examples of people that they came out of their house, and the first people they met, they joined them. And there's a guy called Sean Harling, and he says there's an interview with him, and he says he came out of his house and he walked down the road, and he met the anti-treaty IRA first. He knew them, so he joined them. But if he had come out of his house and walked up the road, he would have met the pro-treaty side first. They were his mates. He would have joined them. So it was, you have all of these. There's no formula. There's no actual, this is the way people chose. This is why people chose. It is, you've got, oh my God. Then there's arguments because, when you've got a common enemy, you can put aside your differences, and there's so many personality clashes in the War of Independence, like guys with egos, guys that are put in positions of power, like the commanding officers, that aren't really good, and their junior officers aren't impressed with them. And there are examples where if those personal tensions rise to the surface once the fighting is over against the British, the personalities come into it, and you do have, there was the Scarteen O'Connors, they're the brothers, and there was an argument that happened in the War of Independence with a guy in their company, and he took the anti-treaty side, they took the pro-treaty side, because of this argument that had happened a year and a half before. And then what is really tragic is the two of those brothers are murdered in their beds by members of the anti-treaty IRA in the Civil War. So the reason they chose to go on the side is because of an argument that had happened a year and a half before. So I suppose leading on from that then, human nature. We can never forget about human nature in this. And what is so tragic about our Civil War, like if you compare it to other civil wars, it's a drop in the ocean, Dermot, because in terms of duration, it lasted 11 months. In terms of the numbers that were killed or wounded compared to other civil wars, it's not that big. However, Ireland is a small country. As you know, Ireland's a village, really. Everyone knows everyone. No one was left unaffected by the Civil War. Every town and village has, a connection to a loss, to a casualty. Ordinary life was affected. Like our main transport system, the railways, which are so essential at that time for mail, for supplies. The anti-treaty IRA blew up the rails so the troops couldn't get from A to B, but they're impacting their neighbours. They lose that support. The viciousness that happens during our Civil War is horrific. And I'm talking about, you've got people who would have killed for each other a year and a half before are now deliberately going out and looking, and when they get them, it's awful. How men who were so close, who would kill for each other, could then do worse than the British did in the War of Independence to their former friends, to, in some cases, best friends. And that's what's awful. But then there are the examples of, despite the fact that you have this split, this ideology that cannot be reconciled, there are moments of friendships and family relationships that didn't suffer. And two examples I'll give you. You've got a man called Pádraig O'Connor and a man called Paddy Rigney, best friends. They were both from Dublin, in and around the Inchicore area, Rialto area, but thick as thieves. Where you saw one, you saw the other, right? And they're active right throughout the War of Independence, but took opposite sides in the Civil War. And the opening battle of our Civil War was the bombardment of the Four Courts in Dublin, because the anti-treaty IRA had occupied that building. So in that building is Paddy Rigney, who's on the anti-treaty side. One of the first people to attack that building was Pádraig O'Connor, his best friend. After 3 days fighting, the garrison had to surrender because the Four Courts exploded and so on. They're taken prisoner and brought to Jameson's whiskey sort of distillery that's used as like a massive building. And Pádraig O'Connor sees in the crowd of prisoners his best mate, Paddy Rigney, and leaves the door open and says to him, get out, save yourself. And he just thought that Paddy Rigney would walk out, but Paddy Rigney let other fellas know, big names know, and like a group of them walk out. But that's the first of a few times that Pádraig O'Connor saved the life of his friend. And the other thing, and I think politics has a really, politics is very dangerous with this, because the speeches and the languages that was used, if we look, right, and I mean, horrific things happened, horrific, awful things happened in the Civil War by both sides, but certainly by the pro-treaty side. There's like murder gangs going around and stuff, and I suppose you've got the protection of the government. The politicians, our two political parties today, are born out of the Civil War. Fianna Fáil are the anti-treaty party. Fine Gael is the pro-treaty party. Every time at elections, like I thought that, you know, when I was growing up, you heard like, oh, it was Fianna Fáil family or a Fine Gael family or whatever. You don't vote for either side. Now, the politicians would, at election time, would bring up all the nasty things that happened in the Civil War. Then you look at the IRA men, who within 10 years of the Civil War are sitting together, are setting up organisations to heal that divide, because they realised so much had been lost. So many, like the giants, oh my God, the people that died in the Civil War in the first few months, that survived, you know, 1916, that survived War of Independence, right? The British could not get them. Yet in the first few months, Michael Collins is killed, Harry Boland is killed, Cathal Brewitt is killed. All these giants, people who were cut down in their prime, and we don't know what impact they would have had on society. What we're left with was very, very conservative. That whole, you know, the counter-revolution ideology comes in then. But there's photographs of guys who did awful things, sitting beside fellas that in 1922, if they caught them, they would have killed them. But there they are, sitting together. So the military men are the ones that try to stop the conflict. But once it starts, there's no going back. But then they're the ones that could actually say, let's heal, let's come together. And then you've got guys who are pro-treaty fellas that joined Fianna Fáil, the anti-treaty political party, because the political party that they supported, the pro-treaty side, they weren't representing their ideas. The Republic was not on their agenda. A united Ireland, not on their agenda. So Fianna Fáil, which was promising that, they see there's the party that can represent them. They were disappointed, but it's I suppose, Dermot, what shows is that there's no, it's not black and white. It's never black and white. It's so grey. And when you look at the politicians and what they say and so on, it seems very black and white. But bringing it down to the people, to those ordinary people that are going to make these decisions, not knowing what's going to happen. Oh my God! Like it's easy to judge 100 years later, going, I would do this, I would. We none of us know, and thank God, though, if there's one positive to come out of the Irish Civil War, it's that both sides realised cannot bring the gun back into political life. There has to be another way. Too much was lost with that fratricidal strife, and the impact, the trauma, that intergenerational trauma. We're only talking about this really 100 years later because it's the centenary, but it's still so emotional. There's so many questions asked, but people are starting to understand now, and not just go, oh, they're wrong, they were wrong. We actually don't know, and we're looking at maybe what life was like at that time, the decisions that they were faced with, and not judging them. Now, there is things that you know, when the atrocities not are taken into consideration, it's wrong. There's no way to justify it. But it's to understand how things like that can happen. There were some that never came back from it, Dermot. Families split, never talked to each other again. There were others once the children started coming along, they realised we cannot let our children suffer from this. And the agreement was, we don't talk about politics. We don't talk. That's it. But it took a long time, and there's a massive silence, Dermot. Unfortunately, and we find that across the world, there is a massive silence. And what that silence reveals is the trauma, the hurt, the pain. And it's not because they don't want to talk about it, just because it brings back awful memories for them. But I suppose they don't want to pass that on to their kids who are children. But if we don't talk about it, it can lead to history repeating itself, you know? It's just all very grey, Dermot. A long-winded answer there, sorry, but it's just very grey. No, the principle is the key thing. And the big thing about the IRA and coming them on and so on, both sides were Republican. They just believed that there was different ways to get to the same destination. So basically, if you think, right, the Republic is here, okay? The anti-treaty side say, my way is better. I want to get to the Republic this way. And what they mean is, we stay together, we're stronger. We know Britain has done this, right? But Britain is this close to giving us, you know, freedom, which was never going to happen. But if we stay together, push a little bit more, we'll get to the Republic. Whereas the pro-treaty side want to go this way. And their thing is that, look, this is as far as we're getting. This is all Britain is going to give. We've actually gotten a bit more than we had originally sort of hoped. It's not perfect, but it's the stepping stone. This is Michael Collins's argument. It's the stepping stone to achieving the Republic. Now, maybe if he had lived, maybe that would have happened. But the politicians that were left after Collins died, they were quite happy with the 26 county state. So the boundary commission that so many people put their faith in moved maybe an inch or two of the border, you know, didn't impact. But both sides are Republican. And there's an example, so Sean Hales, I've written a book about the Hales brothers who split. Now, if anyone has seen the film The Wind That Shakes the Barley, okay, that's this family who split in the Civil War. And they had gone through so much, and it's like, how could Sean accept the treaty, knowing what had happened to his family? His brother was brutally tortured by the British. The family home was destroyed. Their father's mental health suffered. Their sister had to keep everything going. But Sean Hales and his sister Marge took the pro-treaty side because they believed that this is not perfect now, but it gives us the chance to achieve full freedom in the future. Whereas if we don't take this, we're never going to get it. Never. But Tom, his brother William, Robert, and Donald, they all took the anti-treaty side because they believed this is not what we did. We did not do this for a partition country, to actually go in willingly to the Commonwealth. So, and there's a really good example. Sean Hales has given a speech at a council, and one of the councillors says that the anti-treaty side are Republican, and Sean Hales kicked off, saying, how dare you say that I am not a Republican? I am as much a Republican as anyone on the anti-treaty side. So you have that. So principle is the core reason, because these people weren't blind. They weren't like, you know, like, it's not like De Valera is saying to them, oh, you must take the anti-treaty side. These people chose what side to take because they understood what was going on. Like, all of them knew what was going on. They're very educated in what was going on. They're not going into it blindly. Now, it may, personalities and so on might come into it, as in then why they actually chose what side they went on, as in to physically take part in the conflict, personalities and so on. So principle is a huge, it is the core reason. Now, fast forward though to July 1922. So our Civil War began in June. To be a member of the National Army, you had to have either fought in 1916, the Rising, or the War of Independence. You couldn't join up when the truce was on. You've got these people called Truciliers who joined up and the fight was over with the British. You couldn't do that. You had to have proven service. So the initial members of the National Army are veterans, veteran IRA men. But when the Civil War begins, the National Army, the pro-treaty side, realised we're outnumbered here. Like, the majority of the IRA went anti-treaty. They've got guns, they've got a lot of weapons, and we need to recruit. So that's when the change comes, because they put out a mass recruitment drive. It didn't matter who you were. You didn't have to have service. They just needed soldiers. But then what you have with that is that it's guys who do not have that loyalty, who do not have those friendships. And it is about money, because we were bankrupt. You know, like, the people desperately needed money. So it was a job. But you do have then guys who don't have those connections, and both sides do that. The anti-treaty side do it as well. And you've got young lads coming in thinking that it's great that Collins is killed, and the veterans, the men who would have fought with Collins, they realise, oh my God, what's going to come next? He was keeping the lid on an explosive situation, and they were right, because once Collins was gone, then that's the next phase, a more vicious phase of the Civil War enters, because then guys take it personally that they have killed our leader. They have killed our friend who was their friend. And then you see, like, the 2 days after, 4 days after Collins is killed, that's when you see the forced reprisal killings, the murders taking place. And then it just follows from that. So principle is at the core. But when you have that mass recruitment drive in July 22, you don't have those loyalties, and it's diluted, and it's fellas that are joining up because it's a wage. And others then, oh yeah, this is great, young lads, the ego, the sort of the testosterone, they've missed out on the glory of the War of Independence. This is now our chance. Unfortunately, so many of them get killed in the Civil War. So yeah, principle though, they knew, the people didn't go into this blindly. The combatants, they didn't go into it blindly. A lot of turmoil. But then you have, once they make those decisions, neither side will back down. And one thing I will say to Dermot, because they're totally forgotten, there's the neutrals, the people who didn't take part, and who I think are the bravest out of them, because they knew that if we cross that line, we have lost everything. And the British, it plays right into their hands, because it's like, oh, look what happens when we leave. They start killing each other. So we were there to civilize these people. It justifies it gives them that, like, sort of that justification for the colonization. And again, it happens all over. Wherever they live, they create chaos. But the neutrals set up an organization, and they had a whole, like, manifesto. They wanted to set up a political party where it would be looking at the 1916 proclamation, the ethos of that it's, a new Ireland for everyone, equality, and so on. But both sides, both the pro-treaty and anti-treaty side, turn on the neutrals, because they see that they're weak. Like, at least we've made a choice. We're going to stand by this. And they attack the neutrals in the newspapers, calling them cowards and so on. Whereas here's a group of people who say, we cannot do this. Here is another way. Give us a chance. And they're the ones then, they don't last long. It's about a year. But then if we fast forward maybe 10 years and people are looking for jobs and stuff, and there are instances where if you had like a free state company, because it's very hard for anti-treaty people to get work. They were on the losing side, and a lot of them had to get out of the country. But if you're going for a job, and say it was, a pro-treaty person given the job, and if a neutral or an anti-treaty person was going for it, the anti-treaty person would get the job. But what you'd see is that the anti-treaty IRA person would get the job before the neutral, even though like they were the enemy of the Free State person, you know, because at least they took a stand. They made a choice. Whereas I feel the neutrals were the ones who really were the bravest by saying, we cannot do this. We need to put our country first. We know what will be lost. And neither the pro or anti-treaty side will listen to them, but then they're seen as the weak ones. And they're totally overlooked. They're totally forgotten in this story, you know. So they're people that you also have to think about. There will always be the you know, the combatants, as in the pro or the anti sides, but you then will have somewhere in the middle, there will be a group that will try to broker some peace or say there's another way. But generally, they're not the ones that get listened to. So it is possible for some people, for probably a lot of people, to then transition from that life that they have lived, as in it's soldiering, it's, you know, with the women, it's like, it was like intelligence and all of this, you know, dispatch carrying and tending for wounded, and but with a lot of, with there's examples of it again all over the world, you will find there's a like a small core that don't, that they can't. And I suppose the big thing to also consider with groups that have sort of taken part in like an independence movement, they're not soldiers, they're civilians. So their life, the life that they lived, is totally transformed, and they're, you know, engaged in ambushes, in whatever else, like using the Irish example, like you had the officers of the Irish Volunteers that became the IRA. Like initially they would have been Irishmen that served in the British Army, you know, so they used their experience, but who they were training were ordinary people, you know, people who just saw like this is wrong, what is happening, I need to, you know, take part in this. But like the other thing is, like, we use the term volunteer, so anyone who's in the IRA, the Republican movement, is a volunteer because you are volunteering. The majority of them weren't getting paid, so it's a part-time army. Like in the War of Independence, you had guys that were going to work in the morning, okay, and then it'd be like their commanding officer would give them a call, say, lads, there's an ambush, scramble, there's a patrol coming, a British patrol coming, you better be there at whatever time and take part. And then you go back to work. Or at night, when they're finished work, they'd go on patrol. So it's a volunteer army, and that sums it up. So these people are going from civilians, like in some cases students, guys that were going to college, then, you know, join the volunteers. The same with the women, you know, girls that are secretaries, waitresses, and so on. All of a sudden, they're intelligence operatives. They're like, you know, setting honey traps with British soldiers to get the information. And then it's all over. Like it's a very intense period, like of like again, it's unlike sort of India and say Palestine and Afghanistan, where it's that long drawn out process. This was like a very intense, you know, what, 7 year period, and then it's like boom, it's over. What do I do now? And you find that a lot of people just had to transition, had to get back and go, right, this isn't what we fought for. You know, what are my options? Unfortunately, a lot of people had to get out of the country because A, they were on the wrong side. They were on the anti-treaty side. So Ireland was a cold, cold place for those people, job-wise and so on. You do have, again, other examples where people who'd been in prison during the Civil War, when they're released, and you've got this like sort of a murder gang operating in Dublin, and these are the guys that cannot transition back, because these are the guys that had been the assassins in the War of Independence. So their life in the War of Independence was all that intelligence, counterintelligence, And we all know, like, you know, we've seen the spy movies, you know, that's a completely different world. And you find those guys are the ones that really do find it hard to transition back. They're the ones that actually put it up to the new Irish government, because they saw, right, we signed up to this because of Collins's idea that it's a stepping stone. Collins dies. And next of all, when the Civil War was over and the government, the pro-treaty side, the government is trying to, you know, sort of run the country, they start to demobilise the army, but the first guys they're getting rid of are these guys who had that heritage, who had that connection, who would have had that service, because the government realised these guys are a threat. They're ruthless, and they have, there's a mutiny. Like, they basically threaten to overthrow the government because they see that yous aren't doing what Collins had set out to do. And by the way, we're loyal to a man. We're not loyal to the states. We're not loyal to the government. And the government see that these are a real threat. And it's those men that you find that really do find it hard to transition back to normality. And there's a lot of instances, like some of them are involved in are members of the murder gang that operates in the Civil War, because the war that they fought in Dublin in 1920 is very different to the ambushes and so on. Like, these were the guys that walked up to a policeman, a political policeman in the street, and shot him. These are the men who took part in Bloody Sunday on the morning of the November 21st, 1920, and knocked on doors around Dublin City, went into the bedrooms of British agents and shot them. So that's a very different war. You know, when you're fighting at a distance, I suppose you've got that separation, but you then have this war, and a lot of the women who were involved, who would have given the intelligence, given the information, that impacts on them. Unfortunately, now we've been very lucky that there was there were pensions given. Okay, people could apply for a pension who had taken part in the rising War of Independence, and Civil War, but from the pro-treaty side. Okay, it's only when, like, anyone who would be an anti-treaty could not apply for a pension in the early 20s. But when Eamon de Valera got into power in the 30s, being the leader of the anti-treaty side, he opened up the pensions. Now, these are official documents. They were never meant to be released. But as part of our Decade of Centenaries, Military Archives, which is an amazing resource, they have been given the funding to digitise these records and release them. Because the other thing is, this is where you're getting the ordinary people, right? You're not just getting Collins and De Valera and Cattle Brewer, those big names. This is where I'm finding, like, my great uncle was involved. Now, he didn't say much in his pension, but this is where you're getting the ordinary man and woman and what they did. But then you're also seeing the impact of what they did. And unfortunately, with an awful lot of them, they suffered, their mental health suffered hugely. Because again, if we go back to the start, okay, their life, like, you're seeing people, and again, it's all across the world, people who are going about their everyday business, but who believe or have witnessed something that is so wrong, and who are so passionate that this has to be challenged, and they don't go into that lightly. And they become soldiers, they become combatants, they witness and experience horrible things. You then got, like, civilians that are witnessing this and experiencing this. And then when it's over, the impact on them mentally of what they did, it's huge. It's huge. Of what they saw, what they witnessed, what they themselves did. So you do have, there's an awful lot of that. And what you see in the pensions, and it is so, so sad, Damon, because they'd have to give their addresses. And the amount of them that were men and women, and there is women included in this, that they're in asylums, that they're in, like, they've had so much, they can't actually adjust. It impacts on them later on. Because we all know as well, like, when we're young, you know, it's we're invincible, we're this, we're that. And in some cases, I think a lot of them felt that maybe it was the guilt that they survived. Maybe it would have been easier if they had have died in the conflict, because they wouldn't then have to live with the reality of what they had saw, what they had done. Like you have an example of a guy, James Paul Norton, and he actually he took part in Bloody Sunday, and his pension file is there, and but that had a hugely traumatic effect on him, because he was one that goes in to one of these bedrooms and shoots the guys, point blank range. Now the thing is, the British were doing that to them, but he then very soon after, it seems, had like a mental breakdown, and tried to take on. One day he's walking along the street in Dublin City and sees a patrol of British troops and stands in front of them, like, in front of the Crosley Tender, and tries to take it on and ends up getting arrested. But you find that in a lot of the cases, and it's so sad. And I remember I was researching a thing about Vietnam and how war affects those who fight it, And I found a great quote by a guy who was an instructor, that was training these fellas, young men, to go over and fight, the enemy. And he said that during the 80s, if there was like sort of, these mass shootings or serial killer, if they were discovered and found or whatever, the first thing he would look for was to see if it was a Vietnam vet. Because he said, we programmed these people to kill, but nobody unprogrammed them. So you're giving these people, they're trained to be soldiers, and that's the life they live. But then when it's over, no one sort of tells them how to adjust, and you're just expected to, hey, go back to ordinary life, go and be a mother, go and be a father. And I've been very lucky that I've met relatives of the people and stuff, and you see that, my God, they were lucky if they were able to, function, and a lot of them did. They just sort of parked it, get on with it. Were able to maybe have that support, maybe were that way inclined. But sadly, there's an awful lot that it had a huge impact on them. Now we've have, like, we're very lucky as well that we have people who wrote about their experiences, like as in books. And one of the more famous would be Ernie O'Malley, who he's got, there's a couple of books. There's On Another Man's Wound, which is about the War of Independence, The Singing Flame, which is about the Civil War. And they're excellent books. But Ernie O'Malley was a medical student, sees 1916, doesn't take part, but gets involved after 1916. That's the trigger point for him. Becomes an organizer for the IRA, is involved in loads of ambushes, gets arrested by the British, is tortured by the British, is anti-treaty in the Civil War, and goes on, when it's all over, goes to America, travels all around the world. He was an artist. He loved art. He was a writer. I really, really believe that Ernie O'Malley, his calling was to be a writer, and he moves in those circles in America, and he marries I think it's Helen Hooker, and he has a family, and a very close relationship with his son Cormac, and he went around and interviewed former combatants, like comrades, but also people who were on the other side in the Civil War. He was a person that people talked to. And thankfully, all of those notebooks are in UCD archives, and they're accessible. You can go and see them. His writing is atrocious because he was a medical student, but some of them have been transcribed. But Ernie O'Malley is a man that, I suppose, on the outside, he's functioning. He's getting on with it, but internally, privately, obviously, there was some moments, with him that obviously had an impact on him. Like, he was shot so many times. It's a bit like Dan Breen. He wrote his book, My Fight for Irish Freedom, and he wrote that in 1924. And now Dan Breen is a person that I truly believe he's one that loved the soldier's life. He loved it. And if anyone has read Dan Breen's book, you know, it's a page turner. But him and his friend, his best friend Sean Tracy, were the ones that really started the War of Independence in 1919. And I really believe that Dan Breen regretted that he did not die on Talbot Street with Sean Tracy. He was his life. The two of them, like Sean Tracy dies trying to make sure Dan Breen is safe. Dan Breen is worried about Sean Tracy. They went everywhere together. And I do think that that was a regret that Dan Breen had, that he lived to old age. But Dan Breen, interestingly enough, although he's anti-treaty, he's one of those, like a lot of the anti-treaty people, their heart wasn't in it. It was, when they're fighting, it's defensive rather than offensive. But he is one of the first anti-treaty people to go into the government, to enter the Dáil in 26, 27, because Eamon de Valera and the anti-treaty party Sinn Féin, they refused to enter the Dáil, to take their seats in the Dáil. Dan Breen is like, you know, look, the people have voted for me. I'll go in and I'll be there. And he's a fascinating character. Like, now, not you know, he's divisive. You know, there's some of his people who fought with him are going, yeah, he sort of inflates the truth a little bit, you know. But he was one that was, you know, speaking for his former comrades when the pensions were coming out. But definitely a man who his life was, he loved the exhilaration of being in the fight. Now he did get married, had family, but that was not a life for him. His life was the cause, the excitement of being in battle. And I do honestly believe Dan Breen, if he could have written his story, or, you know, sort of decided what way he would go, or end his life, it would have been on Talbot Street with Sean Tracy in a hail of fire and taking out, you know, killing some of the enemy with him. You know, that's, and look, there's others like Pádraig O'Connor, and his nephew wrote a book, Sleep Soldier Sleep, and Pádraig is the one that goes, you know, is pro treaty and his friend is anti treaty. And he went on, we have in the emergency in the Second World War, we call it the emergency. And you have then a division, a special division being created in the army, made up of former IRA men from both sides. And he was a colonel. He was, you know, he adapted to that life very well, and he's brought back in to be a commanding officer in the 26th Division. So you do have examples of them transitioning, others not, others then being greatly impacted mentally by what they had lived through, endured, witnessed, taken part in, you know. And it's yeah, there's no one formula, there's no one story, there's a lot of different stories. Some could move on and adapt easily, others couldn't. And I suppose we find that everywhere. If we can take the politicians out of it, because and you're seeing this with Northern Ireland today. Like there we have an example of two communities that were never reconciled. Like, you know, going back hundreds of years. And I suppose there's a lot of miseducation. There's a lot of oh, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like you believe the propaganda. You believe that the other side is this, and this. And if we strip it back down to the basic level, right? If we look at the ordinary people, and unfortunately religion and politics are always caught up in this, and if we can take them out of the equation, if we can just take them out of the equation, I know it's something that, you know, people's identity and stuff, it's you know, it's part of them. But if we can sort of maybe just put that to one side and let's look at, right, okay, you and me, okay, we're from similar backgrounds, different communities, but similar backgrounds. What are the issues that we face as, say, you know, working class people? we'll find that we actually have a lot more in common than differences. And unfortunately, with politics, they sort of feed the flames to keep that fire of separation going. But that's to serve them, like, look, it's just so frustrating because, like, when you just see, like, kids aren't born with this. It's ingrained in them. It's sort of, it's spoken to them. It's what they grow up witnessing and seeing. And I really think that politicians need to stop and look at what is going on here. And if we put people at the core of this, if we value our people, then can we not listen to the other side and maybe find a compromise? And it's all about compromise, Dermot. It's all about compromise. It's just so sad that when you see conflicts that have been created because of, the legacy of empire, people who had lived, and you see this with, say, India and Pakistan. So people who had lived side by side, Palestine the same, people who had lived side by side. And then all of a sudden, their differences weren't really highlighted, but the British highlight it and make them aware of that they're different. And like, there's a brilliant book, Inglorious Empire by Shandy Thrower. Fabulous book, and there's so many connections, similarities between Ireland and, India, what happened. And again, it's that training ground. Ireland is a training ground for what happened across the empire. And like, you see that in these countries, they did live side by side. Like, you would have differences and clashes and so on, but it wasn't on the massive scale. But it's when a government then highlights those differences and makes a point of saying, you are different, you are better, you are this, and then that all feeds in. So if there was some way that could be removed, and if the people were listened to, if the people maybe, if there's a real communication, if there is listening, that, like, people talk, but who listens? And I think that maybe if people really listened to the what both sides are going through, they'll find that it's actually very similar. Both, communities on both sides of wherever conflict there is are losing loved ones. Civilians are the ones that are being, are the big losers here. They're the ones that are being killed left, right, and centre. You've then got, young lads being either recruited into armies or so on, and it's like someone else is dictating their life. They're not choosing. So communication, talking, but listening. Talk and listen. Really hear what is being said. But I don't know, Dermot, if that can be done. And maybe looking at, like, Northern Ireland is an example, because that was a conflict between two communities that went back hundreds of years. It's not perfect. No way is it perfect. But there are 2 generations, 3 generations now of kids that are have grown up, being able to walk down the street, being able to go to a disco at like 10 o'clock at night, not having to set out 4 hours beforehand because they were going to run the risk of going through so many checkpoints. And it's something that is to be protected. Communities are different. We'll all have our differences. We don't have to like each other, but we've to live, especially if we're living on the same land. It's both of us, both communities, or where many communities, they share that land. And I suppose they shared it before the conflict. Is there a way that we can find to share it again? Not saying that we have to be best friends, and all of this, but I suppose understand, listen, and if the politicians should be the ones that lead by example. You know, it shouldn't be up to the ordinary people to do this, but more often than not, you'll find that it will be the ordinary people that will go work from that community level and try to find a way. And the politicians generally will scupper it, you know. I think if actually the politicians listen to the people, I mean, really listen to the people, and live their life, live one day in their shoes, would we have the, you know, would there be this sort of you know, would they go into conflict or continue conflict so easy if they lived the lives of the people that they represent, if they experience what they experience every single day. And it's amazing then, Dermot, when you see, despite all of this, all of that trauma, all of this, the ordinary people get on with it. They will live, normal life goes on as well. Somehow they find a way to go on. And you know, I suppose they're to be held up. You know, those people in communities that just, despite everything, find a way to go another day, and you know, try and find some hope, or you know, take some solace out of something, and just go and try to make it better for the next generation. Oh my God, like, they are to be, you know, those people are to be put up on a pedestal, and the politicians should live their lives for one day and see if it would make a difference.